The pathophysiology of a disease depends on exactly what it is and where it comes from. Shocking, I know, but take E. coli for instance. Despite it living within our bodies already quite naturally and without issue, from time to time people can come across it, and for some reason, that age range is like 18 to 35, and it's been a higher rate than normal coming across it. Stop that. Which can actually make a person exceedingly sick if it's not really addressed or seen by a doctor, and this could result in their end if unchecked, although it is unlikely. Other things like viruses, which we are all intimately familiar with now, can sweep across a species, and depending on your immunological response to it, this could result in you either taking it out in a matter of days, or the complete opposite. Or even parasites, infiltrating a host organism and altering its very behaviors that keep it alive so that it can continue on its life cycle, and it has done so quite successfully. But nothing out there is more punk made, as in like I have to say punk instead of the other word because it's in the first 2 minutes, than an STD. So take life, right? It's nothing but like boarding a struggle bus from the time that you're popped out to the time that you take your last breath. But apart from like eating, there is one other awesome thing about life, and somehow, some way, microorganisms have found a way to mess that up and use it as a way to reproduce, which unsurprisingly may end up injuring you or hurting your chances of actually successfully reproducing, and it might even threaten and destabilize your body to the point that you end up eating it and taking the dirt nap. I'm serious. We're an absolute losers of like handful of diseases. But enter contracted and contracted phase 2. Oh yeah, it's a twofer today. As a woman meets up with a man under horrendous circumstances, she would end up contracting some form of illness, and instead of getting it checked out immediately, she just sort of ignores it. It's a bold strategy. However, this illness would continue to evolve within her and lead to worsening symptoms and ultimately an infection that would probably threaten all of humanity if it gets completely unleashed. So today, let's talk about the disease itself, the effects it has on a person, and what it may have actually been. But first, this episode is sponsored by Raycon. Are you ready to buy something small with a big impact? Of course you are. Clicking the link in the description or going to buyraycon.com/Roanoke, you can get 15% off your Raycon purchase. Why choose Raycon? Well, Raycons have the premium audio quality at perfect price point, so you can build great habits without breaking the bank. Going to the gym? Pop in your Raycons. Hitting the trails for a run? You guessed it, Raycons. Going for a bike ride? Put in your Raycons. Because of their awareness mode, you can actually hear what's going on around you as well as your music. But you can also just utilize the standard noise isolating fit due to their comfortable gel tips that block out noise. It's up to you. Plus, with their 8 hours of operation time and the case being rechargeable and recharging your earbuds, that gives you over 32 hours of playtime. I personally like using mine when I go to the gym, or maybe if I'm working on a car that's probably never going to run. With their easy connectability, 50,000 5-star reviews, and great audio quality, what's not to like? So if that sounds good to you, then by heading to buyraycon.com/Roanoke, you can get 15% off your Raycon purchase today. All right, let's get back to it. So as always, I'm a shill for Roanoke Tales. We are approaching 100,000 subscribers over there like crazy fast. And I wanted to say I really do appreciate all the support you guys are giving that channel. It keeps me motivated on finding like the real life horror stuff. This week we are talking about the Dogmen of Michigan, so if that interests you, I will link this in the description. Also, all of the Roanoke Tales video over the real life horror stuff are in podcast format on like Spotify and Libsyn and Amazon and whatnot. It's called Real Horror with Roanoke Tales, so now you know where to find that. But let's get to it. So we start off our story with a guy cracking open a cold one without his friends, I guess, because I'm fairly certain that's how you get beat to death. We are at a morgue, and it's gross. And he gets into his car after this, and we can only assume this dude is a total weirdo. Then we get a whole bunch of flower petals falling and a woman spraying an orchid. Great flowers, very top-heavy, tip over a lot. She goes on to call a woman Nikki as she goes to a party at Alice's for the night, but doesn't sound like they're really getting along all that well. Meeting Alice, they are the worst friends in existence. See, this happens sometimes in movies, and I really don't know why. I guess because they're just actors, but have a tough time acting as friends, or maybe everyone who writes any type of movie ever just has horrible friends, who knows. But as Sam talks to her, Alice asks what she's drinking, and Sam's like, "Oh, I think you've had enough." Bro, Alice looks like stone cold sober. What are you talking about? So Sam finally relents and then wants a beer, and then we spot Mr. Night Stalker over there at the party. As Mr. Nice Guy McGee comes up, he offers her a drink, and then just like apologizes for something. So because he's acting like a weirdo, she weird guy zones him and then walks off. We then meet Zane. His name is actually Zane. Like, what are these names? He asks about Nikki, as I'm assuming they broke up, as he offers her a bump to make her feel better. Not helping, man. Sam then goes inside to meet up with Alice and gets her a drink. Creepy antagonist male stands in the background watching her once again as Zane and "but I have great qualities" guy also watch. And y'all, like, get a drink because this thirst is killing you. Okay, so this guy's actual real name is Riley because it's going to be important for the second movie, but as Alice calls him over, she tells him that Sam could be interested. She's not. So Sam goes to call Nikki, but she doesn't answer. There's a lot of names I'm throwing at you, but we'll be out of that soon enough. Breaking up is hard to do, but as she goes inside, old grave robber then scares her and makes her drop her drink, right? He then hands her a cup, and she's like, "Oi, bruv, is this my drink?" And he says, "Yeah, it's totally your drink." All right, so it's now information time with Roanoke. Always keep an eye on your drink. If you see a stranger touch your drink, stand close to your drink, or try to hand you a drink, go get another one. If they insist, give them the middle finger. I see, like, with my age range on this channel, most of you are college students, so, like, keep an eye on that stuff. It's for real. It's happened to me. Luckily, I got out of there, though. So she drinks it while he tells her that she looks interesting. Worst pickup line I've ever seen. Also, the theme for this movie is for some reason everyone, and I mean everyone, probably even the cameraman filming this, is trying to get with Sam. It's ridiculous. So it becomes quite insufferable later. So after a short talk with the mystery man, whatever is in the drink starts kicking in, so they go out to the car. See, watch your drink. And she has officially contracted. It is now day 1 at 2 in the afternoon. Nick finally called her and then sends her a heart-filled message of, "I guess I'll just see you when I see you." So Sam gets up and then goes to check the orchid in her wall. Heading into the main part of the house, she's already super cold. Immune response. Some committee is supposed to be calling back Sam about her flowers, as Sam then gets dressed and then heads out to go to lunch with Nick. Meeting Nick, they talk about the party and gloss over how Sam didn't do anything fun, and here we have the first instance of someone trying to get with Sam again. Well, apart from the party, that is. Waiter comes up asking if he's seen her before and then shoots his shot. I don't know if this was supposed to be like some sort of plot thread that was supposed to exist for another reason, but it's never, like, expanded upon, so I assume he's just shooting a shot. But Sam is here with Nick, so it goes over like a wet fart in church. Back home, Mommy Dearest has served them dinner. They then get into a conversation as to why Sam sucks for not wanting to eat with her mother. Just eat with your mom, dude. They then talk about flowers and have an argument about where she would even go if she did leave, but as she stands up, she gets a cramp. So now, it's day 2, and things are about to get a whole lot worse. Waking up, there's blood in the bed from some obvious bleeding. That's never a good sign, but I'm also sure I can't show you any of this. There are also signs of blood vessel damage coming up from her pelvic region. She takes a shower, and there's like too much blood coming out of her, I'm pretty sure, which can lead to anemia. Regardless, time to go to the doctor to see if this is a problem, but she doesn't. Going into the kitchen, she asks her mom if she's cooking something, and she's not. Which is also not a good sign, because like that could mean you're having like actually a stroke, like legitimately. But anyways, we'll talk about that when we come to the disease effects portion. As Sam goes to help her mom, we also see that there are some cut marks on her forearm from earlier life decisions. Driving into work, Alice calls Sam to tell her that some dude at the party named Brent Yaffe, with a J, has the cops looking for him, so they came and questioned Alice. Heading into work, Sam eats but is completely grossed out by what she's eating. She goes to check on her table, who just got sat, and it's Riley. Then he apologizes again, like, bro, stop. That's not how you win a woman's heart. So as Sam switches tables, because, God, it's cringe because I think we've all been there. You live and you learn. So Sam switches tables and she gets the people's orders, but then she starts to hear a noise as they are ordering. And then this turns into me. It's called tinnitus, and if you watch my Last of Us episode, I said tinnitus instead of tetanus, which is a total accident. But holy lord, is it not annoying. Actually, I just had it last night from clenching my jaw while I slept. 0 out of 10, would not recommend. So she has a freak out, but it passes. However, what didn't pass is the toilet vibe check. Can I say that on YouTube? Well, we're gonna see. It's full of blood. She's not doing so well on the inside at this point, which is not a good sign of anything that's going on. Sam then heads back out to the table and gives them their water and not wine, but as she does, the cramps start kicking in even more, and finally, she goes to the doctor. Should have definitely done that on day 1, but now you're also about to wonder with this doctor how he got his license from a Cracker Jack box. She tells him her symptoms, but he's like completely unfazed. He mentions that her heart rate is really slow, so presenting bradycardia. Also, her ear canals seem to suggest some sort of infection is going on, so she mentions that she has a rash down there, as the doctor then spots like blood vessel damage. The doctor asks if she's active, which she confirms she is, but she doesn't know if she used protection. The doctor confirms that, yeah, she has a rash, some dead skin, and discomfort, and this is like why I think this doctor is not actually a doctor. So doctors typically don't prescribe antibiotics for viral infections because there would be no point, right? However, if you don't know what it is yet, while they do the lab work, it's better to start them on a round of antibiotics like azithromycin if you suspect it's an STD, because it could be bacterial. Instead, he's like, yeah, just put some moisturizing cream on it. Absolutely not. Immersion broken. He says, like, all I can tell is that you have a head cold and a rash. Yes, that is a sign of an immune response, which means something has caused an actual infection. Very good. So Sam then goes to Nikki's, where they talk even more about how everyone wants them, blah blah blah, get back to the infection action. Nikki then tells Sam that she looks terrible, thanks man, as she then hands her her letters that have been showing up there. Sam got Nikki a bottle of wine for their 10-month anniversary, which is a little odd timing, and this whole thing has been painful to watch. They then talk about how Alice wants to hook up with Sam. See, my lord. Also, Sam got her letter from the committee about the flower extravaganza event. So now Sam goes to have lunch with Alice, and her entire iris is red and her cornea is bleeding, indicating massive conjunctivitis. Also, Sam asks Alice about the guy from the night before, as the cops are still looking for him. Sam then heads home at this point for the night and puts on moisturizing cream. Can't show any of that in real detail, but she's actually got maggots in her skin. Gross. Brushing her teeth, like Cortana saying when Master Chief was flying the Banshee to the mall, this thing is falling apart. She literally loses a tooth at this point as well. I would 100% be flying over to the emergency room at this point. Sam also starts hearing things and continuing to devolve into like a worse situation as her flowers have died. Her mom comes to talk to her and asks if she's like preggers or something, and then Sam tells her about how she got into like the flower event. So now it's day 3 of 3 to let us know it's not going to get any better. Her irises are both turning red at this point, and again, the emergency room is just around the corner. She also has sores forming on her mouth and can no longer feel the temperature of water as she burns her arm. Her mom suspects that she's on something as Sam gets into the shower and is showing signs of whatever she has spreaded and damaged more blood vessels, and clumps of hair have begun to fall out. As when her mom spots it and Sam goes to check it out and sees that I'm literally balding. Perfect segue into this episode has been sponsored by Keep. No, it hasn't actually. So she now decides it's time to return back to the doctor. Finally. Okay. On the way there, Sam's boss decides it's better to violate OSHA rules than to be down one server for a few minutes, so he asked her to come in. In fact, this happened to me when I had the stomach bug, and my boss is basically at the time was telling me, well, just don't, throw up in front of the customers. Anyways, I ended up quitting that job like that day because I was like, dude, I'm not serving while I'm throwing up. Managers, am I right? So remember, we are a family here. Also, if they ever tell you this, it's absolute nonsense. You're there for a paycheck. So Sam goes in and then starts making the salads as George then comes in and is shocked. This is the manager, by the way. Is shocked she looks sick. Whoa, I can't believe it. So he tells her that she should basically go to the doctor because she's looking rough, but she just then decides to stay. As she rubs her face, well, a fingernail starts coming off, which you think would hurt, but if the tissue there is destroyed, it doesn't really feel like anything. It's also clear at this point that several other fingernails had already come off too, she just hadn't noticed it. Sam then heads outside as Riley has come to see her again. Riley then tells Sam that he saw her the other night with the guy, and that's the guy that the cops are looking for. Like, bro, I get it, you like her, but it might be time to take a hint. Alice also then calls Sam to tell her that the cops are questioning anyone who was with that guy at the party. Sam gets a call back and then talks to a doctor who at this point still doesn't have the results of the blood test. Gonna have to disagree with the doc in a box when he says the symptoms look viral, but there's no buildup to suggest infection. This man. Anyways, the rest of her symptoms suggest infection. It's just the cornea and mucosal membranes of the eye are not dealing with the infection currently. So I have to agree that is a little odd, but this appears to be more of an internal infection localized to the interior of the eye, at least where you can see it, that in the rest of the body. But what I do know is I'm just a microbiologist, so I didn't go get my doctorate or anything. So anyways, the doctor confirms that this has to be some form of STD, which Sam asks about antibiotics. Then he responds, get this, right? Anything I give you would just be over the counter. The real cure is when the results get back. Full stop. That is not how it works. You cannot get antibiotics over the counter. Doctors can prescribe antibiotics. They would immediately start her on a Z-Pack, which treats like a swath of bacterial infections, possibly even some antiviral medication. I hate this doctor. He tells her don't come into contact with anyone in the meantime, and I'm thinking quarantine would be more effective as a measure, but hey, that's just me. Maybe call those nerds over at the CDC or something. I don't know. So instead, she goes to see her main man Zane for some herbal supplements, which Sam then falls back into some bad habits. Sam tells Alice about what happened, and Alice says that she has to tell the police about what happened. And here we go. Sam then accuses Alice of wanting her to break up with Nikki so that they could be together. Get a grip, man. There's more important things going on. Like, who cares what's between your legs and who wants to see what's between your legs? You are literally falling apart. So Sam starts acting like a real tool, and Zane also sold the rooflin to that BJ guy at the party. Sam then goes to the bar, but as she does, she spots the dude from that night, the BJ guy. Losing him, she then heads home with her mom and apparently a guy named Dr. Sullivan standing there. She had some sort of issue with drugs back in the past, which is why it was such a bad thing that she went and saw Zane, and now I guess Dr. Sullivan was her doctor. But that causes a massive fight as she grabs her flowers and then heads to the competition. She takes off her glasses and shows that her eyes have, or at least one of them has been blinded, and her teeth are basically falling out of her head. Heading to the flower competition, well, all of her flowers are dead, so I don't think she'll be winning. The flower represents her meatsuit failing as well. Allegories. So the guy then runs up to confirm, with probably nobody, that she can't come in, but then basically tells her story that you're out of the competition. She wasn't going to win anyhow. The flowers are dead. I have to reiterate that point. But Sam then goes to Nikki's, but Nikki is upsetty at her because she got loaded and hooked up with that BJ guy. But I don't know, maybe bring up the fact that it wasn't, exactly agreed upon by both parties. That might kind of explain all of this, but I guess life is complex like that. So Sam then bursts through the door and just straight up ends Nikki, which was sort of hilarious because you do not run out of oxygen that quickly. And then her hands were barely on her neck. It was kind of dumb. Anyways, so Sam is now on a rampage, sort of like eating a Lay's chip. You can't have just one. She heads over to Alice's and then they have a fight, and then it turns into everyone being hot and bothered by Sam again, and they make out. Dude, you can literally see the presentation of infection on her body. Why would you make out with her? Also, they forgot to add in her white contact for this scene in the movie, so her eye miraculously healed, but will return later. Sam then throws up in Alice's mouth, which happens. It almost happened to me one time. Thank God, I got away in time, so we're good. But as Sam then bites Alice's neck, hold on now, this is starting to turn into something else. She then ends her with an ashtray, supposedly, but we'll talk about that in a minute, which was pretty brutal. So Sam now calls up Riley because she knows he would come running. My man, have some self-respect. So she puts on some makeup and then covers up the giant sore in her mouth very poorly, and her white contact lens is back. Well, Riley shows up, and she reels him in like a 40-year-old virgin given half a chance. So they go at it, and as he looks down, well, there's maggots all over the ground. Wonder how that feels. He goes and then throws up and tells her to stay away from him before finding Alice's body. Sam then gets in the car, heads out onto the open road, and calls her mom. She then passes out on the wheel of her car and crashes, and eventually she wakes back up, but not as Sam. The cops arrive with her mom as Sam goes and then bites her, which concludes Contracted. So now we move on to Contracted 2, Oh My God Does It Itch Boogaloo. We open up exactly where we left off, which is pretty dope. Guy gets swung on, mom turned into a woman witch, and Sam takes one to the dome. Can't show that. A man with a tattoo named Abaddon, which I'm pretty sure is like a Knight of Hell or something like that, on his finger performs the autopsy on Sam after, caressing her. Stop that. It's now day 4. Riley is a little worried, so he asks to get tested for everything. Party man over here. Riley tells him that he shouldn't tell his sister, like the doctor shouldn't, because it's actually his sister's husband that he goes to see, because apparently that's the only other doctor in the world. So Riley feels like something on his shoulder after the doctor exits the room, and oh yeah, this is a Riley movie, by the way. Checking on his shoulder, he is scratched from earlier, and there's still an entire fingernail embedded in his skin. Ow. He pulls it out, and the nurse comes in and concludes the workup. Heading out to the car, he gets a call that the cops are needing his presence at the station, so he heads over there to converse. And remember, guys, never talk to the cops without a lawyer present. That doesn't mean cops are bad people. It just means you need to exercise your constitutional rights at every turn possible. So he goes through the list of events that have happened in the house when he was alone with Alice, who he had to kind of take out, and also when he was with Sam, who was now taken out. Basically, things don't look great for Riley not being a guy running around taking people out. And also Nikki is gone too, so it's all pointing to Mr. Riley over here. So they then ask him about the party, but he says they were all there just having a good time. That is until the detective pulls out a mock-up of BJ, and Riley's tells the detective, oh yeah, he was at the party. So that's what we already knew, because we all sat through my first summary, Contracted 1, you caught something and now the fun is done. So the interview concludes as Riley heads up to his car and then finds a note that says Big Mouth. Stay strapped or get clapped, you know what I'm saying? Getting a call from a woman named Brenda, she calls and asks Riley if he's going to go to Alice's memorial the next day. He agrees and then heads home to hang out with Grandma. He then takes a sip of her drink, and Grandma's actually pretty lit. Riley then heads to his home office to call the detective about the license plate he remembers. Meanwhile, Mr. Creepy Dude is hooking up with a woman of the night, and she gets out and he hands her $80, even though it was supposed to be like $200, and then injects her with something, assumedly from Samantha. It is now day 5. It's a beautiful day to bleed all over the park. As Riley goes for a run, he approaches a tunnel, then finds a quadruped has seemingly been half-eaten. Going back to Grand-Grands, it's interesting how all of these like full-blown adults live with one another. I'm assuming this is California where you have to live with your parents or even your grandparents. But anyhow, as he goes in, he notes how cold it is, and then he turns up the heat before grabbing some water. Texting the doctor, he goes to brush his teeth before checking his eye for inflammation, and then checking on his wound on his back. Pushing it, some pus does come out, which is to be expected as those fingernails were nasty, and he cleans the wound with hydrogen peroxide and then screams about it, but hydrogen peroxide doesn't burn. That's alcohol that burns. As Riley watches the news, Grandma's nurse comes in, and Grandma has a cold sore for some reason. And if you didn't know, actually this is an issue in nursing homes. STD rates explode in there because people are at end of life, and they're like, screw it. And they actually do. You are absolutely welcome for that mental image that's now flashing through your mind. Anyway, so the doctor then calls Riley to let him know that he's clean. But things like HIV, for instance, can take up to a year to actually reach a detectable level in your body. So 2 days later, you might not actually be clean at all. Just saying, diseases are nightmares. So anywho, the doctor then goes on to mention how Samantha has some sort of necrotic STD, and then asks if Riley hooked up with her. I don't even feel bad for Riley remotely, to be honest. You could be the love of my life, soulmates, known for decades. But if you're presenting symptoms like Sam had, I don't care how hot and bothered I would be, I would not have taken that chance to just have some fun. The only fun we are having is the drive over to the emergency room. Riley says that he didn't hook up with her, and again, it's stupid because exploratory medications could potentially be used. So now Riley knows that he's totally boned because he wanted to bone. Use the upstairs brain, not the downstairs one. And also, there is a HIV medication that if you're exposed to it, I believe it's called prophylaxis, it could potentially prevent you from catching HIV. So you should always go to the doctor if you think you've had an exposure event. So, meanwhile, BJ during all this is a total weirdo. He's leaving messages for everyone about how they deserve the plague, and then we finally see his face. This is the guy that pulled Samantha? Interesting. So as Riley is working, he gets a message about how he shouldn't have done that, and blah, blah, just very nefarious nonsense. But then a woman comes into the clinic who has very similar symptoms to Sam. She has injured herself, and the security guard does nothing to help, and Riley gets blood all over his arm, which is my literal nightmare. Over at the memorial service for Alice, it's a real bummer, as you might imagine, more so because Riley brought a date to the memorial service. Dude, what? So Brenda takes a crack at the nurse, saying she would never have the confidence to wear something so tight. This whole family, apart from Grandma, kind of sucks, to be honest with you. Now, over at the detective office, she's working late on Google Maps for some reason, as Brenda at the memorial gives a speech about Alice, and then goes into a sales speech about her book. See, they suck. Dave then launches into a song about Alice drinking from a chalice in her new palace. But Riley's ears start going deaf during this, mine too, and then he gets a nosebleed, which drips into the cheese dip, sure to infect everyone. Sneezing on the mirror, he tries to clean it up, as Brenda then gets herself a big old glob of cheese dip without looking. That's like some skill, because I'm pretty sure anytime I've ever gotten cheese dip in my life, I always look to make sure the chip is like going into the cheese. Like, you want to know how much cheese you're getting. So anyways, the detective now heads to an abandoned house, or seemingly abandoned, and then pulls an old B&E on it. Entering, wow, this isn't creepy, she finds mannequins set up at the table, and then moves through the basement, but decides no thanks, and then kind of starts to leave. Riley and the nurse then head to the bar to have a few drinks, and while there, Riley continues to get messages about how he shouldn't have done that. He then hits him with the old new phone who dis, which the blocked number then responds, you know who. So, how is it messaging him if it says blocked? Like, shouldn't he actually be blocked? So, did Riley just name this number blocked? Anyways, the nurse is telling him a really interesting joke, but he's not paying attention, so then the nurse leans in and kisses him. Somehow, in the last 2 days, this man has got like some appeal going for him or something. But that's short-lived as the symptoms start getting worse. Except, it's not really symptoms so much like right this second it's BJ. The detective is now in the basement, moving through. Well, she finds a bunch of psycho stuff. It's my party and I'll cry if I want to sort of deal. The nurse, meanwhile, returns to find that Riley is gone. The guy, BJ, says he's like Typhoid Mary and that Riley is testing his patience. Somehow. I don't really understand how, but back in the basement, the detective finds the photos and recordings as well as one of the infected. Shots don't seem to work. She is falling apart though, so you could probably just blow on her and then she'll fall apart completely. But a shot through the dome does end up working as nature intended. So now it's day 6 of 6. You really do only be surviving like 3 days total with this disease. Riley awakens and is presenting even more symptoms of vomiting blood, red eyes, and sweating. As he calls out of work because he doesn't have a manager that's like, no, but what if you came in and violated OSHA, lol. Anyways, and then Riley starts peeing out blood, which, while his tinnitus is acting up too, like double whammy. Checking out his shoulder wound, everything is looking a little more gnarly with rashes and sores all over his back. The CDC has finally been called in, thanks for the quick and speedy response, guys, and they have quarantined the hospital and are asking anyone with the flu-like symptoms associated with anything or redness of eyes to quarantine themselves immediately as well. Riley then kisses his grandma bye. Oh Lord, yeah, she's not looking too good. Meanwhile, some Jehovah's walk down the road to go talk to Gran as Riley makes a few phone calls. He heads to Brenda's first, hearing groaning noises, and then bursts in to find his sister and her husband doing the horizontal mambo. Whoops. So James then tells Riley that he needs to go to the hospital immediately because everyone who was in quarantine ended up biting the dust. Riley tells James about BJ before running out of the house, saying he will come back. Please do not come back. Back at the detective's office, she for some reason has like a super candid photo of Zane, which made me laugh. Like, it could only have been taken by a friend. But now, a chemical biological defense agent from the Homeland Security has showed up to question the detective. My, how the turntables. He plays a tape for her, which basically goes into how humanity is a bacteria and society needs to be cleansed, and how I was always picked last for dodgeball, and the girl I wanted to go on a date with never gave me a kiss. You know, all the real stuff that makes you real edgy. It's like the same people who say, like, humanity is a virus. It's like, shut up. Anyways, he wanted to just feel you guys. So they talk about how they are trying to contain this viral pathogen that is having a 100% mortality rate, which is rather high, as you might know. He says that BJ is the vector, which is interesting to say the least, as he's apparently actively spreading it. But Riley then goes into a shop and gets rubbing alcohol, a lighter, a box cutter, and some whiskey, which is not concerning at all. So the shopkeeper asks, "Are you okay?" And he's like, "Yeah, I'm totally fine. Where's your bathroom?" This man is not all right. So Riley now has the brilliant idea to cut the infection out from underneath his skin, which contains maggots, which makes zero sense because logically speaking, those would not be in there, but okay. But he does succeed in cutting them out. I can't show you any of this. It's basically just really gross. And it's also not really that great of an idea. So he patches himself up at that point and continues driving along, calling the detective. Meanwhile, the nurse has Riley come to her class. How he was able to find her is beyond me. He asks her if she's feeling sick, and she's actually starting to exhibit the same symptoms. Riley continues to try to tell her to go out, but she refuses because Riley is acting like a weirdo again. Not much, I guess, has changed from the first movie. So another guy then comes out to intervene, but then he gets blood thrown up all over him. That sucks, bro. You were just trying to help. Harper then agrees to go with him at this point as they talk about who BJ is. Harper realizes the disease can be transferred by something as simple as a kiss or a drink. And what we're about to see with Grandma, sharing a drink wasn't a good idea. Sort of like mononucleosis. Entering the home, Grandma is completely changed. As she turns around, she's clearly infected, and the Jehovah's are half-eaten in the corner. Grandma attacks as the officers are then forced to open up on her, as the Jehovah's also begin their attack. Harper then helps Riley, who has wounds all over his back, but her eye then starts changing as she goes into the bathroom and realizes, yeah, that eye is blind. It's going to get worse here in a second, though. The detective now calls Riley to tell him Grams is gone, and then Harper just straight pulls out her eye. Man, this disease literally makes you fall apart. Riley and Harper are on borrowed time at this point. He calls Brenda to tell her that he loves her, and then goes after BJ, but stop off at Zane's first. They then pick up some handhelds and then go after the guy. They ask Zane where BJ lives, but Zane is being extra weird about it until the cops arrive at Zane's before he says anything, as Riley is definitely running out of time at this point, and he's then brought to the hospital along with Harper. Harper's heart stops pretty quickly, so she's literally gone less than 24 hours after being infected, and then comes back to in the storage area. Meanwhile, Riley is somehow still kicking despite others dropping really quickly now. The detective says that there are 37 new cases of whatever this virus is, and it's spreading. BJ at this point comes into the hospital and asks where a patient is during a biological outbreak of something that the hospital would be ridiculously locked down. Like, if not recognized, that dude is not getting in. Also, the cops wouldn't just be walking around without hazmat suits on, or even the doctors for that matter, because they don't even know if this thing is airborne or not. The officers then dip out as the detective now starts also exhibiting something. BJ comes in and compliments Riley on how he looks, but the guy has something strapped to his chest, which is a little alarming. He then goes on about how great he is, but as the cops enter from the coffee break, he opens up on them and then hits the detective in the leg. Riley gets free though, and then shocks him in the back with the defib pads before throwing up on BJ's face. BJ is then able to get the force multiplier though, and takes out Riley as BJ pulls the handheld on the detective, who then she just starts screeching. Like, I don't really know what I would do in that situation, but I always figured like detectives would be a little more stoic about it. I don't know. That's a very human response. But anyways, Riley ends up biting him in the neck and then taking him out as the detective then has to take out Riley. And that concludes Contracted Phase 2. Or does it? Because as James goes to check on Brenda, well, she's infected with a baby, Dawn of the Dead style, and then we see the doctor from the first one, he's been in on it the whole time, which explains his complete incompetence. Thus concludes these movies until we get Contracted 3, Why Does It Burn When I Pee? Okay, so, this is future Roanoke, by the way. I've had several cups of coffee, and it's the next morning. I'm writing this, so I'm 100% ready and qualified to talk to you today about STZs. That's right, with a Z. It came to me in a dream. It means zombieism. I'm very proud of it. So I believe I have a pretty good grasp on what's running through the population at this point, and spreading from person to person, but to understand why this disease in mind is the case, we need to first understand the pathophysiology of this illness, which will give us a pretty good understanding of how to stop it. We see there is actually a nice timeline set up for us concerning the infection of Sam and subsequently Riley. However, something to note is Sam appeared to devolve into a worse situation the longer she went, and Riley did maintain his mental faculties to the bitter end. And even if you throw Harper into the mix, within 24 hours, actually less than 24 hours, she completely drops. So there seems to be different responses for different people, which is fairly standard with actual most diseases. So also, I want to point out there is a hard line with this transition into the deep infection stage of its presentation. So what do we know first? Well, first thing on the list is that BJ is a complete and utter weirdo, and unbeknownst to us for quite some time, he was working with a local doctor who would see patients who apparently had this disease, which would be Sam, and feigned complete incompetence and just wanted her to rub some cream on it.
Rub some dirt on it, bro!
I believe this is more intentional than you might actually realize, and based on what I believe it to be, it sort of makes sense. Because there's actually medications that might work on this illness, not to mention, despite having no clue what it was, he labeled it a virus immediately, but I suppose that's why it's always important to get a second opinion on everything. The next question is, how was this actually made? See, there are two lines of thought on this from happening in the beginning. I'm not saying BJ wasn't a complete weird dude, right? But there are a few things in the movie that signal maybe it wasn't what we thought it was. So the first line of thinking is basically he was hooking up with a body and inadvertently caught something, and then it turned out he was doing it all along, yada yada yada. But the second line of thinking is not that, at least that's my hope. It's clear that he was trying to make something by obtaining diseases that others had to become the Typhoid Mary he wanted to be, which if you aren't familiar with that term, Mary Malone, commonly known as Typhoid Mary, was an Irish-born American cook believed to have infected between 51 to 122 people with typhoid fever by accident. The infection caused 3 confirmed deaths, with unconfirmed estimates of up to 50. So essentially, if he wanted to infect people, that's what he would be. However, one of the ideas was if he was using himself as like a vector or a biological container for the disease and its subsequent spreading, then why wasn't it progressing in symptoms? I think it is shown that he never had any intentions of infecting himself with anything and instead was using the syringe to infect. What this means is I don't think he was getting frisky with that body at the beginning, but was collecting a sample of what was in there to add to the concoction of viruses. That's my hope anyhow, because had the body itself been infected with what he was working on, then he exposed himself to that infection and he would have succumbed in 3 days just like everyone else. Instead, once obtaining the sample, I believe that was the last piece he needed to basically infect Sam with this experimental virus. After her infection, she would apparently be watched by BJ as he was never too far, and it seems like all the while he was kind of hooking up with random women, injecting them with the syringe, and then moving on to the next one to get the disease continue to spread to others. You know, how microorganisms work and all that. Working in tandem with the crackpot doctor, they seemingly both were interested in bringing about the end of the planet through this new virus they had produced, but I wonder if they meant to create the infected walking around, or if it was just meant to make people drop, because how would that have been planned for, I hear you asking? Well, judging by the infected within BJ's basement, they appeared to be his family at one point, so I think the first experiments obviously were on his own family, which is a little messed up as you can gather, but this is where he would note the effects of the virus that they had created and what it would do to the Homo sapiens central nervous system, which let's take a look at the effects so we can get like a good grasp on how this first started taking off. Upon initial infection, it seems to me Sam just straight up had things happen that'd be unpleasant, and she was infected after with a syringe. Upon your initial infection, the virus is incredibly fast acting. Due to the speed at which it moves through the body, we can assume it was later at the party when Sam hooked up with BJ and was infected, so waking up roughly 12 to 16 hours later, she was already showing symptoms and signs of her infection and how it was progressing. It began simply enough as a comment that she was cold in the house. This would later be corroborated by Riley after literally hooking up with Sam during her deep infection state, which was about the most dumb thing you can possibly do. Like, I myself have walked away from way less sketchy stuff in the heat of the moment. It's literally not that hard. Just use the brain upstairs. And if you do this, you too can achieve greatness. I'd be inclined to believe it to be basically a fever, but due to the speed at which this disease moves, I think it might have more to do with the actual heat sensing ability of the body, accompanied by possibly the activation of the immune system as well. Thermoreceptors in the skin are free nerve endings that are also housed in the liver, skeletal muscle, and in the hypothalamus. These kind of keep an eye on the exterior and internal temperatures as well to keep the body in homeostasis, allowing for us to exist within a wide swath of temperatures. The issue is, once the nervous system becomes completely compromised, or at least somewhat compromised, where all these receptors report to, no longer interprets or passes along the information as effectively. As a result of not receiving information on how things are going, the body may automatically assume itself to be cold because consistent information isn't flowing. So again, take tinnitus, right? As the hair cells in your ear are destroyed, they are no longer reporting to the brain that they are moving in the presence of changing compressional waves of air. As a result, your brain, being the true loser that it is, thinks, well, since I'm not receiving information, I guess what I'm really hearing is eeeeee, and that's tinnitus. It's not damage from your ears producing that sound. It's your temporal lobe being an absolute idiot. And that's why people in the past have unfortunately tried to escape their tinnitus by having their auditory nerves cut, thinking that this would fix it. But instead, now they cannot hear anything and are only left with the tinnitus. A literal nightmare. Anyhow, same concept here, which as the disease progresses, we begin to see it has several ways of moving around the body, and this ultimately begins to cause the breakdown of the human meatsuit. Shortly after Sam wakes up and goes to work, she begins to have issues with her hearing, which would begin to imply that the auditory nerve damage is mounting, amongst other damage in the areas, such as the peripheral nervous system. These are becoming quite common. It may make you wonder how it's traveling around the body that quickly, but it seems pretty evident that because of the blood vessel damage stemming from the pelvic region, that the bloodstream is being utilized and is also compromised as it's traveling around the body. The blood vessel issue is actually worse than you might originally think, because while we see the blood vessels on the surface are changing color, indicating blood has actually begun to leak out beyond the vessel walls, or it's becoming hemorrhagic, we can assume that deeper within the body the results are worse. The iliac arteries and iliac veins would be affected by this virus rather quickly, seeming as the female reproductive organs are located right next to it, and also require a massive amount of blood supply to be basically transfused and pulled back all the time, because that needs to be kept healthy. So once entering these two vessels, it's basically going to continue to head south via the iliac arteries and infect the muscle and nervous system tissue, along with all the epithelial tissue, to begin its destructive. It's also probably breaking apart connective tissue, considering everything is not doing too well. Some of the virus would enter the iliac veins and then head towards the vena cava, and eventually that means it's going to make its way to the heart. This infection of the heart appears to happen within the first 48 hours, but probably closer to 36 hours of the virus entering the body, and this would result in the slower heartbeat that the doctor described, which is likely brought on by a form of myocarditis or pericarditis, which is essentially inflammation of the heart tissue or the pericardial sac around the heart. Either of these could result in a slower heart rate for the person, and while this is happening because it's in the blood of a person, it continues to spread to all corners of the body, including the brain. One of the things to note about this virus is it doesn't just infect and cause inflammation, but also seems to bring about the actual breakdown of, again, the epithelial tissue, as briefly mentioned earlier. What effects would this actually have on the body, though? Well, it's clear that in some respects, this explains the bleeding. Much like with the Ebola virus, as blood continues to leak out of the blood vessels and into the body, this would dehydrate a person quite a bit and make their oxygen saturation levels tank as a result. But this also means likely every blood vessel is contending with the same issue. This would result in things like blood leaking into the stomach as well as into the lungs, and continue to leak out of every orifice it possibly can, which we have seen with Sam. Not a great thing to experience, I imagine. As this process continues, we can also see it more clearly happening within the eye of the person as well. the eye bleeding becomes apparent, and this is what prompts Sam to finally go to the doctor, but she picked the wrong doctor. Go to a hospital for stuff like that. This bleeding would also cause immense pain in areas like the abdomen and, in general, muscle aches all over the body. The breakdown of this tissue is noted in several ways. The first is when Sam's fingernails begin to break off. This indicates a dissolving of tissue to hold the nails into place, and as a result, nothing has attached them to the nail bed anymore, and this allows them to actually painlessly come off. Another example is when her tooth comes out rather easily as well. This would mean the connective tissues have also begun to break down, meaning that given enough time, it's possible that Sam just kind of devolves into a puddle somewhat. Another example is the lesions forming all over the body as the skin sloughs away and the infection begins to enter the skin along with the virus itself likely being present. And the final example that shows in the later stages of likely muscle, epithelial, and connective tissue breakdown is when Harper is literally able to take out her eye as nothing was holding it in place anymore. It's a little ridiculous that her muscle would have broken down to this point. I mean, absolutely, but there's actually a reason this area is so hard hit, which we'll cover in a moment. Something to note about your body is it isn't just going to take this lying down. The second the virus enters the body, an immune response would be launched. Macrophages patrolling around, hanging out, having a good time, would come into contact with infected cells and the virus itself. Utilizing its pattern recognition receptors, or PRRs, they would end up detecting the viral components like RNA and DNA and immediately induce type 1 interferons and pro-inflammatory cytokines. Once this happens, they will begin searching for viruses to engulf. The thing to note about the uterus and genital area in general is that the immune system is actually very active in certain portions of it. In fact, it's called the miracle of life when a fertilization happens because the immune system is destroying any sperm cell it can prior to the egg getting hit. Anyhow, as the innate wages war on the invader that is currently screwing everything up, it's clear with this specific virus, the game is sort of rigged from the start because the adaptive is never able to be given a chance to get involved as it happens so quickly. The innate, however, will call in reinforcements such as dendritic cells, which get involved to take the information to B cells to see if anybody actually recognizes the infection. T cells would also start to be mobilizing a response, but again, it takes only a few days for the virus to end up taking you out, and unfortunately, it takes a few days for the adaptive to really start ramping up. So, it's all innate out there concerning the response as inflammation increases and resources are spent fighting a broad spectrum war on this virus. And this would potentially inspire the fever in Sam if it is not just due to her nervous system being damaged. But the virus continues on because of the speed that it is able to infect, and this ultimately outpaces the human immune system as the innate immunities would begin to run out of steam because at this point it would be time for the adaptive to sort of take over, but the body then already loses to the virus. Not only that, but the virus begins to enter an immune privilege site that would make it increasingly difficult to fight. Because of its quick access to the nervous system, and that being the main target it appears, the body would not fully be able to remove this virus from itself without damage to the nervous system. Because of likely horrendous interactions in the past, or like the distant past, and I mean even still to this day, the immune system will attack the nervous system to disastrous results in autoimmune disorders, the body typically has a very light touch way of dealing with infections near the central nervous system. In some cases, it's really not much it can do, and seeing as it doesn't want to destroy the nervous system, it just has to deal with infections that may pop up when a virus is hiding in it. So this can lead to terrible results like meningitis or infections in the retinas or eyes, or in general, just all around immune privileged sites, but this causes the immune system to sort of back off because it doesn't want to destroy these necessary cells. Eventually, as this progresses, it ultimately results in the infected that we actually see at the end of the movies. This infection, however, is not, I think, a form of zombieism, as in like post-mortem, but instead is a disease that affects the living and keeps them alive. While Alice seemed to be donezo, it's possible that she did survive in a comatose state after being hit in the head by Sam after she was bitten. But it really doesn't seem like she was hit that hard enough to crack through the skull, in all honesty. So the question becomes, what exactly is this virus? So here we have this virus that houses itself in the nervous system, causes sores to form on the body, and causes a rash and lesions to form all over the body. Well, if it isn't our old pal no, it's not rabies. Thankfully, it's our no longer with us companion, the variola virus, or essentially what it appears to be is a form of smallpox. However, there are a few differences with this disease to say potentially someone actually added in viruses together for funsies to create something worse. Which, let's get into this because there is another virus added into the mix that allows it to do what it's able to do. The smallpox virus was a complete clown back in the day. It was humanity's constant adversary because of its consistent surge and retreat. This literally led us to invent vaccines in an effort to get rid of it. So a little bit of history. In 1796, Dr. Edward Jenner would go on to create a smallpox vaccine for our species, as he noted that people who were exposed to cowpox, which is related to smallpox, but a much more mild form, did not seem to get smallpox after their infection cleared. Over time, he would go on to infect a few younger people with consent with cowpox, and then attempt to infect them with smallpox once their infection had cleared. But they would never contract smallpox. Eventually, cowpox infection would be used to prevent smallpox infections until a more sterile vaccine would come about. A little less than 200 years later, the last person would be infected with smallpox in 1977, indicating that we had eradicated this absolute doucher of a disease. To date, there is supposedly a few remaining sources of smallpox in the world in labs. Those labs say, oh, we already destroyed it, but they probably didn't, because why would you destroy that last? It's important to keep that, because, I mean, you may ask yourself, why do we need to keep it? Well, it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. If there's ever an outbreak again of that crap, then we can rapidly create vaccines for it, rather than having to get it from a natural source. So now the thing is, the actual curse of smallpox and just how horrific it was is lost on us, because for most people alive today, they've never seen the effects, more so in first world countries. Essentially, smallpox would create painful blisters and lesions all over the body, and if you were lucky enough to survive, then you would be disfigured for the rest of your life. Now, you would typically survive smallpox, but again, it would absolutely ruin your skin, and that's just not great. But that was the best outcome you could hope for once you contracted it. In 5 to 10% of cases, with 72% of those being younglings, it would then turn into malignant smallpox, where there were pustules that would fill with blood, essentially, and it was almost always fatal between the 8th and 12th day of symptom presentation. Hemorrhagic smallpox was also a form that could happen 2% of the time, which resulted in extensive bleeding in the skin, mucous membranes, and gastrointestinal tract and viscera. Is that sounding familiar? Well, it should, because we have definitely seen that in the movie, and would most likely be what's happening in adults. The skin would begin bleeding and then turn the skin black and charred looking, and it was typically fatal once the onset of these symptoms began. Now, the thing about smallpox is typically it's inhaled, whereas with this virus, it was like contracted through some other way entirely. I believe the smallpox virus was also combined with everyone's favorite turd in the punch bowl, herpes virus. However, I believe it to be HSV2 instead of HSV1. Now, it sounds ridiculous to combine viruses, right? Oh God, you're wrong. It actually happens more than you might realize, which is horrifying. It's known as reassortment, and it's as bad as it sounds. This is the process when two or more different viruses essentially mate, if you can call it that, which allows for genome segments to combine to make a new strain of something else entirely. It's not as prevalent. It doesn't create as many issues as you would think. In fact, it happens a lot like in influenza, but it can be done. And if you are intentionally trying to do it, it becomes easier. Isn't human being fun? So a little bit of history on HSV2 and HSV1 for you real quick, so we know what it can do and why it's so aggressive, or at least one version is. First thing to note about HSV1, or herpes simplex virus type 1, is it's native to Homo sapiens, and as a result of this being native to our species, it appears less aggressive and more fine-tuned to be in our bodies without too much disruption, typically. There are many types of viruses like this, such as the varicella zoster or chickenpox, Epstein's-Barr virus, which creates mononucleosis, the kissing disease, amongst many other forms. These viruses will hide in your nervous system and go dormant for a period of time before sprouting out to create cold sores or sores in general. But there is this misnomer about HSV1 that it is responsible for only cold sores. You can absolutely get HSV1 downstairs as well, but it's a little less adapted to the sacral ganglia. Kind of in layman's terms, I mean, it is still adapted to it, but this generally makes outbreaks not as common, which makes people unaware that they are infected in the first place. HSV1 is typically found in the trigeminal nerve, which resides behind the eye, and every once in a while, it'll produce cold sores that we're familiar with. Then there's the worst version, herpes simplex virus type 2. HSV2 actually did not originate in humans. Instead, it originated in chimpanzees. Make of that what you will. This version is used to dealing with a stronger immune system and has not fully adapted to the human body, and as a result is much more aggressive because there's actually less resistance to it. Once entering the body, usually through the genitals, it will enter the sacral ganglia, which it will then come out as genital herpes. But remember, it can still absolutely exist within the trigeminal nerve and come back as cold sores on the mouth, but much more plentiful. Some people actually also never exhibit symptoms, but others get absolutely wrecked by HSV2. HSV2 being more aggressive also has been noted as creating more issues in the body as well. It should be noted that HSV1 can still do this, but HSV2, due to it being more potent, as you could say, and capable, this can result in neurological complications such as meningitis or inflammation of the meninges, as well as an attack on the central nervous system like the brain itself, the retina of the eyes, the brainstem, cranial nerves, spinal cord, and nerve roots. Sounding familiar, isn't it? When Sam was having issues recognizing heat, it's likely her brainstem and nerve roots were under attack at this point and reporting incorrectly to the brain. During a reemergence of the virus, it can also at first cause things like headache, which Sam had, which she thought was a hangover, neck stiffness, and a low-grade fever. It will result in a rash to reform as well as pustules to burst to the surface and leak out the virus along with body fluids as your body attempts to subdue the outbreak once more. As the virus continues to make itself at home, it will continue to settle into your nervous system, and for some time, if the symptoms lead to meningitis, this can actually result in your end through things like brain damage and oxygen starvation. Herpes is always regarded as an annoyance nowadays, more than anything, but it can still absolutely wreck your meatsuit. These two viruses, likely HSV2, due to its ability to infiltrate the nervous system, and smallpox because of the physical effects it has on the body, were likely combined within cadavers housed in the morgue to cause a reassortment event, and with it, a new form of virus. Because the bodies had infectable cells, but nothing really pushing around the body, like the body itself, it was able to incubate and combine to create a disease. Now, there's probably easier ways to do this, but hey, why not? So, why it results in the infected we have seen is because the body, that as it breaks down, it still wants to survive and will attempt to compensate for the presence of this new virus. As the brain experiences the meningitis, as mentioned earlier, this causes it to become largely damaged, which will lead to a person become momentarily comatose before completely changing into the infected. It can then be rationalized that this is because of the brain damage amounts that have built up, and the person's cerebrum is highly affected, leading to a decrease in cognitive thought, and with that, their humanity leaving them. They then become violent and more animalistic and may turn to things like biting. As the virus filtered through subsequent generations, it became more and more familiar with the human body and began to make a solid line where symptoms of the disease would officially take over instead of a more gradual degradation as with Sam. So the funny part about all this, well, I think it's funny in a more, wow, there's actually a way to stop this already, is that an antiviral medication would stomp this thing out. Valtrex, valacyclovir, acyclovir, whatever brand you want to take, it's actually a highly effective medication in treating things like HSV1 and HSV2, as well as many other versions, like chickenpox, for instance. It can help there. It can help with things like mononucleosis. There's just so much as a medication that it can do, and they actually think now that had it been administered like during smallpox outbreaks, it would have had tremendous efficacy in treating the symptoms and preventing them from getting out of control. So if you have anything like a herpes virus, getting on medication can help prevent the spread of it and make your symptoms much easier to deal with, just so you know, whether it's cold sores or genital, doesn't matter. Or I even knew a guy, a nurse or a teacher kissed him on the eye or forehead when he was a kid, and then boom, he had herpes on his forehead. It was crazy. But considering it's like 1 in 4 people out there now, probably higher at this point, limiting it is likely ideal. But regardless, these antiviral medications work by disrupting how the virus is able to reproduce and prevent it from being able to spread to the next healthy cell. Eventually, I know it's being worked on right now, but CRISPR is sort of touted as possibly being utilized to try to remove latent herpes viruses from the nervous system tissue in order to actually eradicate it from the body, which is the biggest issue we have now, because we can suppress it like hardcore, but we can't completely destroy it yet. Ultimately, this is a combination of two viruses, HSV2 and likely smallpox, formed within the body of the deceased and then disseminated into the living, that results in brain damage as well as a progressing rash and lesions and breakdown of tissue in the body that eventually leads to the external presentation of fingernails lost, skin lesions, and then ultimately even an eye being popped out, as internal structures also have to contend with more and more difficult constraints, ultimately leading to the breakdown of cognitive function, causing the person to enter an animalistic state where they lash out and bite, which results in the infections of others. Likely this would rapidly spread through a population if not contained quickly, because if herpes itself is anything to go off of, it appears humans cannot control themselves. On top of that, Shortly after infection, the viral load has already reached a point where it's able to infect others efficiently, which does not bode well for our numbers and is outside of the typical norm of what you would see.